E a gente está ao vivo. Oi, gente, aqui é a Bruna e a gente vai começar mais uma live aqui no canal, dessa vez com a Kiersten White, autora de A Sombria Queda, de Elizabeth Frankenstein. Esse livro muito legal, que é uma adaptação de Frankenstein, da Mary Shelley. Vou conversar com a Kiersten, que está aqui ao vivo com a gente. A Tassi, como sempre, vai traduzir a conversa para vocês que estão no chat e não conseguirem acompanhar em inglês, mas lembrando que essa live vai ficar disponível aqui no canal a partir de amanhã de manhã. Então vocês vão poder assistir tudo de novo, se perderam algum momento aqui, se chegaram atrasado, então podem ficar tranquilos. Kiersten, so nice to have you here. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I'm really excited.
I'm so happy to. Yeah, I'm super excited about it too.
Do you want to introduce yourself a little bit for people who don't know your work?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Kiersten White. I am the author of 13 novels for teens and adults.
Whoa.
My most recent is The Dark Descent of Elizabeth Frankenstein. It's a retelling of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein from the point of view of Victor Frankenstein's bride.
Yeah, that's really cool. There have a lot of questions about that, by the way, but but first I wanted to start asking you, what's your relationship with the original work of Mary Shelley, with the original Frankenstein? Did you read it when you were a teenager, when you were a kid, or did you just read it like a couple of years ago?
Yeah, I read it as a teenager.
Okay.
It's pretty common in the United States to study it in school, and so it was one of the rare older books that I really connected to, and I really loved it. But it always kind of bothered me that the women characters in it weren't very interesting, because Mary Shelley, the author, is such an interesting person. The fact that the female characters were pretty boring and just really like one note, it always kind of bothered me. And so when I decided to write a retelling, I knew that I wanted it to sort of be a conversation with the original, in which I said, where were the women? What were they thinking through all this?
Yeah, and actually that's something really interesting. The first thing that got me curious about the book was that it was from Elizabeth's point of view, which is a character that doesn't get a lot of screen time in the book. I read it right before I read the Elizabeth Frankenstein, so it refreshed it in my mind. And I was like, she barely appears in the first book. And in your book, she carries the whole thing. And I know in the author's note, I don't know if the US edition or it's just a Brazilian edition, but I think it's both. You mentioned a little bit why you chose to tell her point of view. Can you tell a bit more for the people who haven't read the author's note?
Yeah, so it's funny how people will read Frankenstein and they'll barely remember Elizabeth when she has this really like interesting, weird backstory, and she has this like terrible, dramatic fate.
Yeah.
But because she's she's just such a like a non-character. She's barely on the page. When she is on the page, all she ever is just like sweet and happy and angelic. And so I thought, well, that's not real.
Nobody's like that.
More complicated than that. And so I really wanted to sort of pay tribute to Mary Shelley, who wrote this book as a teenage girl, and explore the fact that there's so much going on under the surface with girls, with teenage girls in particular. And the world likes to tell teenage girls that they don't matter, that they don't even matter in their own stories. And so for me, it was really important to tell Elizabeth's side of the story and to say, like, just because you've always been told you are... you belong to somebody else doesn't mean you can't be your own person.
Yeah. I actually, obviously I stalked you a little bit before I did this interview because I want to be prepared. It's not stalking if there's a purpose.
No, it's research.
It's research. But I remember a video that I saw when you went to Comic-Con this year. You had a panel with Tony Adeyemi, Daniel, Victoria Schwab, and Maggie Stiefvater. And you talked a little bit about that, about how women and female characters, even real life and in fiction, they're often treated as objects, and they only exist for a certain purpose. And most of the times, that purpose is being there somehow, either supporting or dying for the male character.
Yeah.
And I feel that you took Elizabeth from the original work, which is exactly that. That's what she does. She just stands there and she's pretty and she's cute. And in your book, she takes the narrative in her own hands. How did you thought about creating her personality in that matter? Did you always think that Elizabeth from the original work is the way you wrote her here in your book, or did you just create her personality as you went?
I definitely was one that didn't really notice her when I studied the book when I was younger, just because she didn't matter. And it wasn't until I decided to write a retelling that I kind of narrowed in on her, and I thought, well, if that was your life story, if as a 4-year-old you had been taken from poverty and given to this rich family, but you only existed because they wanted you to, and you only had safety and food and clothes because they wanted you to, like, what would that turn you into? And I think that girls are always told, like, these are the things that you can be. You can be nice, you can be pretty, these are the jobs that you can have, don't ask for anything outside of those. And I certainly got a lot of that growing up, not necessarily from my parents, but from the community and from the culture. And it can make you a really secretive person, because you're only allowed to show this much of your real self to the world, so all the rest of it is interior, and it makes you secretive, and it might make you a little bit manipulative too. And so that really informed my idea of Elizabeth. I thought, okay, well, what if she really does seem like the person that she is in the original Frankenstein, but that's just because she's hiding everything else. And once I realized that in my head she was this secretive, slightly manipulative person, then I knew that she was a character that could hold a whole story.
Wow, that's really cool. That is really cool. When you said what you said about the roles that we are put in, not by yourself, sometimes not by our family, there's something, one of the questions, I'm jumping ahead now because this is like one of the last questions, but sometimes I feel like we don't know what we're looking for in stories until we find them. Sometimes is that connection with the characters, sometimes it's a feature on us that we never see in books, and then when we see, it's like, oh, I missed that. I didn't know I could have that in books. I felt that way when I first saw female characters being actually friendly to each other because they were friends. And I saw that when I read a book that sets in the northeast of Brazil, which is where I'm from. I live in the southeast in São Paulo. But it's really different from where I'm from here. And I didn't know that I could read books that had characters from there. And when I did, I was like, oh my God, we can exist in fiction. So I wanted to know if you ever had that, oh my God, I can be in this story when, as a reader, when you were growing up, or maybe when you were older, because that only happened to me like 2 or 3 years ago. And as an author, you try to create that moment to your readers.
Yeah, and I think that's part of why getting increase in representation in books is such a beautiful thing, because I want every kid to be able to pick a book and find themselves in it. And that's so fun that you found like your specific region that you were from. Wonderful. I was lucky. I read Anne of Green Gables, which is by Lucy Maud Montgomery. It's an older book, but I read it when I was young, and the main character, Anne, is really smart. She's very competitive. She's very ambitious in school, but she's also very imaginative and dreamy, and can get in trouble because she's too busy like thinking up stories in her head to pay attention to what's going on in her real life. And when I read that as a kid, I had that moment where I thought, this is me. This girl is me. Like, I love my imagination. I want to be in my head all the time, but I also want to be the best in my class and be the smartest in my class, and that's really important to me. And seeing those qualities in a character that I liked so much was the same. It was really validating to me, because I was like, oh, you know, all of these things are things that are worthwhile and things that are valid. And just because it's a kind of a quiet story and maybe like plot-wise not a lot happens, it was still worth telling that story, and that meant a lot to me.
That's really cool. When you were saying, oh, she's competitive, she's ambitious, like, yep, that's me. Yep, keep going. Totally relate to that. What's the book again? I actually have that too. It's on my TBR. Well, everything's on my TBR. So
it's a really sweet book. It's really beautiful.
There's a series. Like, there's a lot of books in Gables, right?
Yeah, I think I've only read a couple of them, but it's one of my all-time favorites.
Something that I'm actually curious, that's not on my list of questions, but since you mentioned Frankenstein is read when you're in school, when you read Anne of the Green Gables, something that we lack a lot here in Brazil is that the only, not the only, okay, but the books that we usually read when we were in school, especially around 14 or 15, they're usually classics. But like, read classics that we cannot relate nowadays, because so that actually creates a barrier for a lot of people with literature. So we're forced to read those stories that we cannot relate, that they usually don't have teenagers or young adults as characters in those stories, like one or two exceptions to it. And that's all we're exposed to. Now it's been changing for the past couple of years, but I wanted to know, how was your experience in high school or maybe middle school with the books you had to read as part of the curriculum and your relationship with literature in general?
Yeah, I think that can be a problem, is there's this idea that these are the books that are good books that kids can learn from. And so those are the only ones that are given, and those are the only ones that are taught. And it's almost they're the only ones that are taught because they're the only ones that have ever been taught, and so nobody has ever stopped and said, is there a reason we're reading this? Like, what does this actually add? And it is a big problem when those books are so hard to relate to. It can teach kids that reading is a chore. It's homework. It's not something that you can do for fun, to find yourself, or even to just find adventure. I was really lucky in that my parents really encouraged me to read on my own. They bought me a lot of books, so I always had books that I was reading just for fun, which I think made it easier when I did have to read those books for school, because I had been given books for fun so often that it made those books a little bit more accessible, not necessarily enjoyable. I really hate a lot of them. But yeah, I feel like that's kind of part of what I want to do with Elizabeth Frankenstein is give young readers another sort of access point to the original book. The language is a little bit more accessible. The plotting is a little bit faster. And so that once readers, maybe this is their first introduction, and then having this background, they'll then go and read the original Frankenstein with sort of a different lens and that connection to it already, which makes it easier to read something. I feel like if you have an existing connection to a book, that always makes it easier to get into it. It's like when you read Shakespeare plays, they're impossible. Like, you don't understand anything. They don't make sense. They're super hard to read. But then when you see one performed by really good actors, you're like, oh, that's what that meant.
Oh, so that's what he said.
And then if you went back and read it after that, then having that sort of context and that experience of the story, you'd be able to appreciate it more. So I think a lot of times, some of these classics can die, that's okay. But B, finding new ways to engage with the stories, to update them, to modernize them, or to just make them a little bit more accessible is always a good thing.
I read somewhere, again, research, not stalking, that you that you like to develop your stories, your book plots around one central question. That sometimes you get the inspiration from one question and you develop, and there you go, there's a book of 500 pages. And with the Darken trilogy, specifically the first book, the question was, again, research. How do people get to the point where they can justify atrocities in the name of pursuing their goals? What was the question that inspired you to start The Dark Descent of Elizabeth Frankenstein?
So with this one, I felt like the central question of the original Frankenstein is what makes a monster? Like, what goes into making a monster? And so for my book, I wanted to explore who makes a monster. Who are the people who allow these things to happen around them, who maybe aren't the ones making them, like, they aren't the monster, they're not doing the terrible things, but whether through inaction or through greed or pride, they're the ones who are allowing the monster to find victims, or even helping the monster come into being. And so for me, that was the question that I wanted to explore, is not what makes a monster, like what are the qualities that make somebody a monster. I wanted to explore who makes a monster, who is the one responsible ultimately.
Whoa. Well, that can, if you think about it, it's really deep, because we have to like, my mind goes straight to all the studies about serial killers, for instance, or psychopaths or anything. I can help but think about when we have school shootings and people say, oh, sometimes, blame it on the parents or blame it on the way they were raised. But you know, everything is an influence. You know, the environment you are, the way you were born, the way you were raised, but even the school environment and the things you consume and all of that. And I think nowadays that question of who makes a monster, not specifically a monster, but who makes us who we are, is so relevant and so important to discuss right now. Whoa, that can go really, really deep.
It's a big question.
Yeah.
And I tried to explore just a very small part of it, but you're right, you know, and I feel like in my country, in the United States of America, we have a lot of really terrible things in our history, and we have these things that were done that were just inarguably bad things, and we kind of try and say like, oh, well, bad people did those, but there were a lot of people who supported those bad people doing those bad things, and like, where's their responsibility? When women wanted to get the vote, a lot of the white women threw women of color under the bus, and they just said, well, you shouldn't give them the vote, you should only give us the vote. And they sort of leveraged that to try and get their own rights. And it's just like, they were supporting, basically, they were supporting white supremacy in order to protect themselves. When really, you know, we're all women, we should be supporting and protecting each other. And so these are all, you know, and I feel like they're still very modern questions, and they're still very relevant questions. So these are all kind of the things that go on in the back of your head as you're writing something, and as you're thinking about what are the ideas that you want to explore. Because the fun thing about writing retellings is, it's set in the 1700s in Geneva, but really you're telling a very modern, very real story with it.
Yeah. That actually connects, thank you, it connects with my next question, which is this year is the mark of the bicentennial since Frankenstein was released. So that's why the book happened. And obviously there were a lot of things that were, let's just say, different. So we don't say racist and homophobic and transphobic and all the phobias there can exist. Well, I can say everything. It's my channel, so. And with a retelling, you have the opportunity to change that scenario, to change those characteristics, but at the same time, you might be too attached to the period you're writing. If you're writing a book set in the 1800s, you can just say, oh, so there you go, gay marriage is fine, everything's fine, because that's not the situation they were living. So I wanted to ask you, how do you filter, or how do you decide what stays from that period, from those facts, and what do you change?
Yeah, so with this book, because it is a direct retelling, I needed to stay fairly faithful to the characters as she presented them. Okay. Well, obviously, you know, fleshing them out, making them more realistic, but I definitely wanted to bring in more women characters, and in particular, there's only one new character I made. Her name is Mary Delgado. Yeah. And I presented her as, she's an immigrant. She's an immigrant from Spain, so there are certain levels of prejudice there against her. But there was a lot of travel, even in this time period, within Europe. Yeah. There was a lot of travel, and there were a lot of people from other countries and from other races and other religions, and it wasn't as uncommon as we tend to present it. And it's always important to me to bring those elements out. So for the Anti-Darken series, which is set in the 15th century in the Ottoman Empire, I brought in a lot of LGBTQ characters because while history kind of tends to ignore them, we know we've always been here. And so telling those stories, it was just a matter of finding ways to tell those stories. And so it was really important to me to have that representation on the page. And they weren't necessarily going to be able to be out because it was not a society where that was a thing that was possible, but you know that they were there, and they were finding each other, and they were forming their families and their found families of friends and allies and people who would protect them and fight for them to have their own happiness. So it is really important to me, even when writing retellings or historical fiction to bring those not as any part of an agenda, but because it's realistic.
Yes.
Because it's an accurate portrayal of humanity and humans and human interactions. So.
I'm so happy, so relieved. Yeah, but I totally agree. When we see, and more we see new kinds of thoughts of research actually in history and historians, and more we see more gay people or LGBTQ people throughout the history that we don't learn in school. And there's a whole problem there, how people think we should learn or we shouldn't learn and all that. But more and more we've been seeing even people of color, not only LGBTQ, but people of color who had a really huge impact on how we live nowadays. You can see with the NASA women that got the movie 2 years ago. They were so important, and they didn't have their space to tell the story. So it's really refreshing, really comforting to see the authors are actually concerned and showing we've always been there. This is not now that we're starting to appear in history. We've always been here. You just haven't seen us. Whew, so happy. There was one question here from someone that's watching. If you're interested in doing more retelling, so I know you've done in a Darkened trilogy. It's based on was it his name? What's his male name? I only think of Vlad. My mind's trying to go to Lada. Vlad Dracul. Okay, so it's kind of based in his story. And you have Frankenstein. I know you've launched a middle grade book, right? The Beanstalker.
Yes.
So
and that one is based on fairy tales.
Yeah.
So I have Slayer coming out soon.
Yes.
Pretty sure. Yes, it's coming out in Brazil too. And it's a Buffy the Vampire Slayer spin-off series, which isn't a retelling, but it is kind of similar in that I'm playing in a world that already exists. And then my next series, which hasn't been announced yet, is also a retelling. I really like retellings because I like that you have that sort of base level of familiarity, and then you can build a new story on top of that. Like, I feel like there's a lot of value there.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, do you feel more comfortable with retellings? Like, I like this story, but I want to give it a twirl. I want to do something different. Or do you miss creating the whole world building and the whole thing? Because I think retellings are actually pretty great. Like I said, there was a lot of characters, a lot of people who didn't get their story told. Because in those classics, if we get literature from the 1800s, you never see people of color or LGBTQ people. Or when we see, they probably die, or they're slaves, or they're in a bad situation. So to me, retellings are really important for everybody. And yes, both retellings and new stories are important. You know, to me, it's not less because you're not creating the whole thing. How do you feel?
And there is so much creation that goes into it, because you have to take the existing story and decide how you're going to tell it. And you really still have to build that world around your characters and build that world for your readers. You're just working off of an existing idea or an existing plot or existing characters. And in a way, all writing is retelling, and you pick a specific type of story, and that's the type of story you're going to tell. Retellings, it's just immediately identifiable what type of story you're telling. I don't really have a preference. Like, I really enjoy retellings. I like the challenge of taking something that's familiar and turning it into something new. But I also like building my own stories. It just seems lately it's all kind of worked out to be stories that have that sort of core element of something that's familiar. But yeah, I enjoy doing it. I wouldn't say no to doing it more, but I also really love coming up with like entirely my own story. So I feel very lucky that I get to do both.
Yeah, you have 13 books now, right? Is it 14 with Slayer, or is it Slayer the 13?
Slayer will be 14, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I think you have like 5 or 6 or 3 from the In the Darken, then the Beanstalker, then Frankenstein, then Slayer, not stalking, research. It's like 6 or 7 retellings, and the other half is
the other
your own. So it's fine, yeah. since we're talking about retellings, you have based on fiction, Beanstalker and the other fairy tales in Frankenstein, and you have some written based in history and real people and real events. And how was it different from the process? How were I can't speak English. How different were the processes of writing those different kinds of retellings? Do you feel you have more freedom with one or the other? Is it one harder or?
Historical is definitely harder because history is not contained. So you might have a person show up in the middle of Vlad Dracula's rule, and you're like, okay, I can use him for this one plot thing, and then you realize he has like decades of his own actions that like predated and postdated, and it's messy. There's no, stories come packaged for you. There's a shape to them, and history is not. And so taking history and deciding this is what I'm going to use, this is how I'm going to shape it into a narrative, it's very challenging. I did thousands and thousands of pages of research for the Anti-Darken books. I read all about Vlad Dracula's life. I read all about Mehmed the Conqueror's life. I read about the Ottoman Empire and all the 1,000 years leading up to when Mehmed was there, so that I would know everything that sort of went into why is the empire how it is at this moment in time. I read about surrounding regions. I read about religion and religious history and just everything, because I felt like since I was basing it in history, and I was changing quite a bit. I wanted what I kept to be as accurate and as truthful as it could be. And so that series was so much work. It was so much work.
They're kind of big.
Yes, and they're very large, very long books. And so figuring out how I could take as much real history as possible, but still craft a compelling narrative from them when history is not a narrative. It was really challenging. It is much easier to say my research material is the novel Frankenstein and also Mary Shelley's life. That's this much compared to so
But did you feel
historical fiction?
Did you feel some pressure because you were writing a retelling of such a esteemed and such a put in the pedestal kind of classic? Frankenstein is the freaking first book in sci-fi. It's a big deal. Did that hit you at any point, or you were just confident and chill? That you...
I definitely felt a lot of responsibility because I do love the original, and I love and respect Mary Shelley so much that I really wanted my retelling to be very respectful toward the original. This definitely wasn't an I can do it better than you type of retelling. It was there's so much more story here, and I want to explore that as a conversation with the original. I did. I felt a lot of responsibility toward the original because I do love it, and it is so important, and it impacted the world so much. I really wanted my book to be able to stand next to it in a way that complemented it.
What I felt when I was reading your book, and that's completely different from the Frankenstein, is that the Frankenstein is overly dramatic, and I say overly in a good way. Everything is so dramatic, and Victor Frankenstein is so, oh my God, his life is so difficult. That's the feeling I got. Oh, his life is so difficult. He has a mansion in Geneva, and he goes to the university. Oh, poor me. And in your book, you have more of a mystery kind of vibe. You have more of a action. And did you plan it? You wanted to do something different that didn't have that kind of melodic rhythm, melancholic, not melodic, melancholic rhythm to yours, or just happened naturally?
Well, part of it is our books are always a product of when they're written. And Mary Shelley was at the height of the Romance period, where there was a lot of describing nature for pages and pages at a time.
Mountains and mountains.
Mountains. So many mountains.
So many Easter eggs here about mountains in the original book.
Yes, so many mountains. And then they also did that thing where they have a frame story, so it's never just a person actually experiencing the story. It's a person who has been told the story, telling the story to somebody else. And
that is really cool.
That was just one of the was one of the conventions of the time was having this sort of frame story, so that you're like several steps removed from the actual story. And so for me, I wanted to pay tribute to that, but at the same time, like, I couldn't write a book like that. I couldn't write a book in letter form. I actually tried. It didn't work. We don't write books in letter form anymore because it's boring.
We're writing emails or text messages.
Yeah, and some people do that, and it's a really fun way to
it is.
But for me, I wanted it to echo the feel of the original, but it also needed to be a modern story. It needed to be something that readers today will connect with. So I did focus a lot more on sort of the adventure aspect of it, the mystery aspect of it, getting stuff done. Because, you know, Victor as a main character, anytime anything bad happened, he'd fall into a fever. Have a fever for like 2 weeks.
Oh my God.
And I was like, no 2-week-long fevers. We still got to get this story moving. So yeah, it's kind of a reflection of our books, no matter when they're set, are going to reflect the time period where they're written. Yeah,
every time that he fell into a fever, I thought, oh yeah, health sucked back then. Yeah, makes sense.
He was also trying to get out of stuff. He was like, oh, I don't want to deal with this. I'm just going to have a fever.
I'm just going to lay here for 15 days. When I think about taking some time off for 15 days, that's a hell of a lot of time.
Yeah.
I think I remember a scene in your book when she's going to Scotland. I think some part of the travel, it takes like exactly 2 weeks or something like that. It takes a long time. And I was like, oh my God, she spent 2 weeks on that. Damn, it's such a long time to be traveling. But again, you have to buy a horse or a boat, and you have to roll no more as anything.
You have to get there.
Yeah. Letters took many months to get to the places. But okay. Something that I was really entertaining to me, it was the Easter eggs you laid around the book. So sometimes you see a mention here or there. So when they mentioned Victor's diary, he's prone to fiction. So he writes that thing happens in your wedding night. And it was like, what? I know the story. So how did you decide what to put as an Easter egg or a joke here and there in the book?
Well, I wanted to make sure that people who were really familiar with the original would find those little things where they were like, I see what she's doing. And they would be little references, like when the monster says, I think one of my names was Felix.
Yeah.
There's this really long offshoot in the original Frankenstein where the monster is just like watching a family for like 50 pages.
Yes.
And he's not even part of the story. He's just watching a family. And the son of that family is named Felix. So I couldn't include them in the book because it didn't really make sense.
It's such a long part of the book.
It is. And it doesn't do anything to move the plot.
No!
But again, it gets a product of its time. That was a very normal way to tell the story.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of my way of like winking at it, like, hey, they're not in this book, but they're still in this book. And then, it was fun finding those ways where I could nod very directly to the original. But especially Victor's diary I included because the original book is told in first person, and so I just took the point of view that Victor's an unreliable narrator. So the story that he's telling you is not necessarily everything or exactly how it happened, and the diary was sort of my way of reconciling the two accounts and saying, like, if you know his side of the story, that's where this came from.
Something that, to me, your description of the monster, or Felix, or Adam, or however you want to call it, or Frankenstein, if you want to go into that. Actually, it felt to me really close to Mary Shelley's description, which I found out after I read both books, that it has nothing to do with the movie version of Frankenstein. And I was like, how did people get there? But I wanted to, I wanted to ask you, how do you imagine it? Do you think were you concerned to actually get the description really close to the original? Or you just imagine your own version kind of different and you put it there and it just happened to look the same?
Yeah, no, I worked very hard to make sure that my monster is very close to the original. The movie versions they always sort of present him as this lumbering, awkward,
green sometimes.
Green, speechless thing.
Yeah.
And he's not that way at all in the original book. He's fast and he's strong and he's eloquent. He speaks like a poet. And that, to me, is always so much more interesting because it gives him so much more agency, because he is intelligent, because he understands the world and is so sensitive to it.
Yes.
The movie versions tend to make him more beast than man, more monster than man, and the book version really emphasizes like he has all of the faculties of a person. And one of the really fascinating things in the book is it's sort of this offhand description, but Victor talks about how he used people parts, but he also used some animal parts.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, that's interesting. And so in my description of the monster, the creation, I made sure that things were all just a little bit off. Like, kind of looks like a person, but then you notice things about him are like, that's not right. And so so I definitely wanted the monster in my book to be Mary Shelley's actual monster and not the movie reimagining of him.
Awesome. I think that's really good. I think it was well done. And I think it is a really good retelling because I was talking with a friend earlier. It's something that was really interesting to me, and we discuss this a lot, is why Elizabeth is the way she is. And it reminded me of what you said back in the panel at Comic-Con, that sometimes when we get, I think it was Victoria Schwab that says that, sometimes we put characteristics in a female character, and it makes her unlikable. And when we put those characteristics in a male character, they're not unlikable. They're fierce and determined and brave. And that really got me thinking, because I think my mind directly went to the stereotype of, maybe she's not a nice person. Maybe she's, I don't know, just kind of evil, kind of sketchy. But then I thought, is it she though? Is it really? Or is it just the patriarchy in my head?
Yeah, or is she just a complete person?
Yes.
She's not a caricature. And I feel like people are so complex, and we all contain so much capacity for good, and for pettiness, and for manipulativeness, and for genuine love and kindness. And the thing that I love about writing complex female characters is the more we do it, the more we're telling girls, you're allowed to be human.
Yes.
You're allowed to be angry. You're allowed to be sad. You're allowed to have deep ambition. And so, like for me, it's not about likable versus unlikable. It's about presenting female characters as real people.
Yeah. Likable for who? Like, who is going to judge if she's likable or not?
Yeah. Exactly. She's just trying to survive. She doesn't care if
that was really
she's
cool.
likable only insofar as she needs to be.
Yeah, she's likable if she wants to be, because she has to stay there. And that was really cool. And it really got me thinking, I have to take the patriarchy out of my head. What am I doing to myself? There are a few questions that came from the audience. Some people were asking about the Slayer, and did you already finish writing it? What's happening with it now?
So book 1 is totally done.
Okay.
It comes out next year. I'm not sure the exact publication date in Brazil. It's about a brand new Slayer. Yeah. Her name is Nina, and she has a very sort of painful tie to Buffy. Okay. And she was actually raised as a Watcher in the Watcher Society, like Buffy's Watcher Giles. Nina was raised as a Watcher. So when she becomes a Slayer, she's not very excited. So that's kind of where the
Giles as a Slayer.
Yeah.
I think it comes out not so long after it comes out in the U.S. Hopefully.
Oh, good.
So. I know that the translator is already working on it. He's a dear friend. He's really great. The book is in very good hands. I know he's working on that. So maybe mid-year it will come out.
Oh, that's exciting. Yeah.
Since I mentioned Tonya,
I always get excited when my books sell in Brazil because I love Brazilians and Brazilian readers. You guys are amazing.
What I was going to ask.
Every time I sell in Brazil, I'm like, yay!
What I was going to ask is if you're interested in coming to Brazil, and if you're planning on coming, if that conversation's already happening. Because I mentioned Tonya Dayami, and she lived here in Salvador for a while. And I think her book, Children of Blood and Bone, actually got some inspiration from
Yes, she was inspired by some art that she found there.
Yeah.
So I love Tommy. She's fantastic.
She's so amazing.
I don't have any plans to right now, but it's definitely something that I would be open to if a publisher wanted me to come, or if there was a book festival or something. It's a little bit harder for me to travel because I have 3 kids, and they kind of need me sometimes. Still, not for very much longer, but right now they need me. And so, but yeah, I would love to come to Brazil someday.
How is it, your relationship with your books and your kids? Do you let them read how old are they, by the way? I know one is like 14.
My oldest is 14, and then I have a 12-year-old and a 5-year-old.
Okay, so a lot of age ranges. So have you read like the middle grade, or the 14 already started in YA?
It was really fun writing the middle grade Beanstalker because I got to read them the stories as I was writing them, and they like helped me with like some word choices and some jokes. I have not let them read the Anti-Darken series.
Oh no, not yet.
Yeah, those are a little bit mature, and also I kind of feel like I don't ever pressure them to read my books because I kind of feel like it'd be a little bit weird if you were reading your mom's books and like the characters are kissing very passionately, and you're like, Mom,
it's
why are you thinking about this?
It's like that movie trope when you have the mom who's a writer. She always writes these erotica and really romantic and sexual books. It's like, Mom, please no.
I'm not that bad, but like so yeah, most of them they have not read, and that's okay. Like they really like what I do. They're very proud of it. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of them end up being writers. They're all really good writers and artists. But yeah, I'm like, no, you guys can't read the Anti-Darken series yet. Like, top shelf. You can't have
it. Just so you know, the translator for Slayer, his name is Eric. He's actually watching us right now.
Hi, Eric! Thank you!
And he said he'll be done with the translation by November, so pretty close. So maybe like in the beginning of the year, we have the book, hopefully. But yeah, it's in really good hands. He's also a Buffy fan. I forgot to ask that when I asked you about the retellings. And what about the Slayer? When you wrote it, you have this huge fan base and this huge significance in the 90s and pop culture in general. Because I remember when Slayer was announced, I thought, yes, a book, please. Because I only watched the Slayer like a couple of years ago. I didn't get it while it was being released. And I was so upset. I wanted all the material. I wanted all the extras and the books and the comics. And it was I was so happy when they announced it. And I'm going to fangirl a little bit. I was really happy that you're the one writing it. Because the Anti-Darken to me created such complex characters. And when I think about complex characters, I think Buffy. So, no pressure. But how was the pressure to write that story?
It definitely was different writing it because all my books I write for myself first, and the audience is sort of imaginary. But this one, the audience is very real from the day it was announced. Like people are waiting for it, and people already have an emotional connection to the material. Like Buffy means a lot to a lot of people, myself included. And so I felt again a lot of responsibility telling this story to be because it's not about Buffy, it's about a new Slayer, so I needed it to be a new thing, but I also really wanted it to have that same sort of feel as the original, because one of the things that I really love about Buffy, and that I think is why it resonates with so many people, is because, she's this super powerful demon hunter and the chosen one, but she's also a teenage girl, and the show treated those aspects of her life just as seriously as they did the monsters. And I always really loved that the friendships and the romances and the relationships were just as pivotal in the series as the monsters and the apocalypses and the vampires. And so I really wanted to capture that sort of balance where, yes, the story is big and there are monsters and there's a potential apocalypse and all those things, but at its core, it's a story about a girl trying to figure out who she is and who she wants to be when there's so much pressure going on all around her. So it was a lot of responsibility, and I definitely felt that more than I expected to, I think. And I hope that I did it justice because it was really important to me.
Oh yeah, you did. It's fine. I'm sure it's fine.
Thank you.
Fine. Since we're talking about the complex characters in the And I Darken, I forgot to ask you earlier, actually, how was it to build the relationship between Lara and Radu in the trilogy? Because I think that's one of the things that's most interesting to a lot of the readers. And it's one of the things that actually Tassi asked me to ask you, because it's really interesting the way they're kind of opposites, but at the same time they're not, because they're so similar. And putting them as opposites just to break them down and show they're pretty much the same person, it's really, really cool. And I think Radu doesn't exist in history, right? He does. He does? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know history.
Yeah, and that was actually sort of the inspiration, because Radu and Vlad were, as children, sent to the Ottoman Empire as political prisoners, and they were raised in exactly the same way. They went through exactly the same things, but they had exact opposite reactions to it. Vlad went on to fight against the Ottomans for the rest of his life, and Radu converted to Islam and stayed loyal to the Ottomans for the rest of his. And that was really fascinating to me. I come from a big family. I have 4 brothers and sisters.
Oh my God.
And yeah, it's interesting when we talk, because we had the same parents, we had the same experiences, we were raised with the same sort of values and rules, but even the exact same things we remember differently. Yeah. We have totally different emotional reactions to things that happened. And that's fascinating to me, that 2 people can be in the same family and go through the same things, and just the way that you experience them is totally different. And that's part of why I like sibling stories so much. I think it's just so fascinating, and there's so much to explore there. And that was part of what I wanted to do with Lada and Radu, is sort of explore that sibling dynamic. And also I needed a balance in the story. I needed 2 characters who wanted very different things and went about getting them in very different ways, just to sort of have sort of a counterweight. Yeah,
sure. Okay, so I want to do like quick questions, probably things you've answered 1,000 times, but
that's all right.
We have to cover it, because we're really interested. You said you want to come to Brazil, you want to create a whole thing in social media and ask the publisher to bring you, so we have to know these things. So do you plan your books, or you just go with the flow?
It just depends on the book. I prefer to just go with the flow, but some projects I have to plan.
Okay. Do you rewrite, you revise and do it over and over again? You go back to the same scene and a lot of versions a lot of times, or you just work slowly and carefully in each part until it's the way you want it?
I tend to spend a lot of time not writing.
Okay.
I spend months just thinking about a story, so by the time I actually write it, I'm almost there. So I do have some books that have been very heavily revised, but for the most part, by the time I actually write the story, it's pretty much done.
Okay. And you took a lot of time with the And I Darken trilogy, because a lot of research, like you said, thousands and thousands. But how long do you usually spend on the book? Let's say the Beanstalk or Frankenstein, not the And I Darken trilogy. How much time you spent researching and how much time you spent writing?
So with The Darkest Side of Elizabeth Frankenstein, I spent about 3 months researching, reading the original, researching about Mary Shelley's life, and trying to see if I could write an epistolary novel. And it didn't work. And so after having that, it really didn't work. So after having that 3 months of the research and the work, this version, the version that you can read, I wrote in 6 days.
No.
Yeah. So once I finally figure out the right way to tell the story, I'm a very fast writer.
No. Are you serious?
Yeah.
6 days. Did you do nothing else except writing during those 6 days?
Well, I still took care of my kids. So, I'm still making them dinners and taking them from school, and I still sleep, because I can't give up sleep anymore. I'm too old.
I learned that after a few months of therapy. I learned that I cannot give up sleep.
No, you can't.
It's
never worth it.
Whoa.
I will say, early in my career, I did give up sleep, but I was a lot younger, and now I'm just no.
We all make that mistake. It happens. It's a phase. It's a phase. It's just like liking My Chemical Romance and all that. It's a phase. there is a question from a friend of mine. She asked, how was it for you to finish the Anti-Darken trilogy and finally say goodbye to those characters? It's been so much time researching and creating, and I'm not ready to say goodbye yet. The third book is coming out here next year, so I have the second book. I've had it with me for a while now, and I cannot pick it up because I cannot finish the series. I cannot go any further and know that it's going to end, so it's been a struggle. I was a lot more emotional than I expected to be, because I have a short attention span. I tend to get bored. So by the time I get to the end of a trilogy, I'm like, oh, just end. But when I got to the end of Bright We Burn, I cried. I cried through several scenes because I had spent so much time with those characters and really gone on such a journey with them that to be able to give them an ending that I'm proud of and that I hope is really satisfying, just ended up meaning a lot to me. So I cried quite a bit. Yeah, I cried in the first book. I'll probably cry in the second and the third. It happens. I think we all have been there.
Yeah. It feels a little bit weird when you're crying over your own book. You're like, I wrote this. Why am I crying? But it's all right.
Well, you're crying because it's a lot of work. Like even if you write it in 6 days.
I did not write those ones in 6 days.
No, I know, but even with Frankenstein, if you do write it in 6 days, it's still a lot of work. It's a lot of time. Okay, so the most general question, but I do have to ask, how do you feel that you've changed as an author since you started and now? Like, you see the differences and the errors you made as a young author, like not sleeping, and you see it now. How was that growth for you personally and professionally?
Yeah, I think that I'm a lot more confident of a storyteller now. So, for example, both Anti-Darken and The Dark Descent of Elizabeth Frankenstein, I wouldn't have been able to write those 8 or 10 years ago when I started. I wasn't ready to. I wasn't ready to sort of explore those parts of myself in order to write a story. And that was something that I grew into. And I don't feel like technically I was a strong enough writer to be able to pull off something like the Anti-Darken trilogy, and it was all the books that went before where I learned this is how you construct a narrative, these are how you create compelling characters. It all just sort of builds on itself. So, like, I don't look back on my early books and think, like, oh, what was I thinking? Like, I look back on those and I think those were the best that I could do at the time. I was telling the stories that I could tell at the time. But I couldn't go back to them. Like, I'll have people ask if I would ever write another sequel to, like, my first trilogy, the Paranormal-se trilogy, and I wouldn't, because that voice and those stories aren't the ones that I'm interested in telling anymore. Like, I loved them at the time, I'm very proud of them, but the way that I've grown as a writer and as a storyteller, it's not something that I'm interested in.
Yeah. Oh, it totally makes sense. You evolve, your writing evolves, and then the place of your, like you said, Mary Shelley wrote the way she did at that time, and it's not just centuries and the context historically we are, it's actually the years that we're living. And I don't know, maybe in a few years you want to write stories that your children will read and you'll be proud of it. And yeah, it changes. I can totally see a difference from the paranormal series to the current books you have. Another question is, what's the best advice you've been given to about writing? Probably came from Victoria Schwab because she gives all the best advices. But
you know, writing advice is hard because it's so different for everyone. Everybody goes about it in such different ways. But the two biggest things are read widely, pay attention to what you're reading, and then give yourself permission to create something imperfect. I think sometimes we have these stories in our head, and they're so great in our head, and when we write them, they're not there yet, and it can be frustrating, and it can make us want to just stop. But you can't fix something that isn't written. So give yourself permission to write something that isn't what you want it to be, knowing that as you're writing, you're learning, you're getting better, and you'll get there.
And it's really cool. It's a great advice, actually. I wanted to ask you, okay, so now you have 14 books, but you still have a lot of books to come out in the next couple of years. So what's coming out? We have the sequel to Slayer.
So we have Slayer and the sequel to Slayer, and then we have my next trilogy that hasn't been announced yet. So I can't talk about it.
Is it nerve-wracking when you have something cooking here and it's like, oh, this is happening, I've written this, But I can't say anything.
The only weird thing is when other books get announced that are a little bit similar, and you're like, I promise I'm not copying you. I wrote this book a year ago. But yeah, no, it doesn't. It actually doesn't bother me because I'm like, if nobody knows about it, I don't have to promote it yet. I don't have to worry about that one.
I've seen a lot of authors struggling with. There's some period that I'm just writing, and there's a period that I'm just promoting. Do you try to do a little bit of both at all times, or you rather have some time to write and have some time to promo, or if you could, you didn't promo at all?
I find like promo brain and editing brain are very different, and they're not compatible. Editing brain is where you're looking at everything super critically, like how can you improve it, what's wrong with it, and if you're trying to draft at that time, it doesn't work in a draft, because then you're just trying to get the story down, but instead of enjoying it and figuring out the story, you're like, oh, this is garbage. And then promo just takes so much energy.
Yes.
You have to constantly be thinking about it, or like, you know, I'll do an interview, but like I'll answer 5 questions for a Q&A, and it takes me all day, because even though they're each only like 2 or 3 sentences, I'm like, what if these are the only 2 or 3 sentences a person ever reads of me, and this is my only chance to convince them to read my book? And like, only 3 people are ever going to read that Q&A, but those 3 people got a lot of work from me. So yeah, they're really not compatible. It's very hard to balance them. I'd say that's the most difficult part of the career of being an author, is figuring out how to balance deadlines and pressure with keeping that safe creative space in your brain.
Okay. You mentioned YA authors, so where are some of the authors you are inspired by or that you would recommend for us? There's a lot of YA fans watching. A lot of people that I know are really excited, and it's always really exciting when we see authors that we like being friends with other authors or recommending each other. Like, oh, they're friends. It's so cool.
Yeah. Well, my best friend in the whole world and one of my absolute favorite authors is Stephanie Perkins. Yeah, she's the greatest. So she wrote Anna and the French Kiss, Lola and the Boy Next Door, Isla and the Happily Ever After, and then a slasher novel called There's Someone Inside Your House. And they are all great for different reasons, really amazing characters. I love her books. And if you want to be a writer, they're really good ones to study for character and setting. She does such a good job with both of those. I really, really love Laini Taylor. Her newest, Strange the Dreamer.
Yes,
Has that come out there yet?
I don't think it's come out here in Brazil, but we know of it.
But do you have Daughter, Smoke and Bone?
We do, yeah. We have that one.
I love that one too. It's so beautiful. Her writing is her imagery is amazing. Just really, really phenomenal. And then there's a new book out called Sadie by Courtney Summers.
I think I've seen that on the Goodreads Choice Awards. I was looking at that. I think it's in there.
Yeah, I wonder if it's been translated yet.
I don't think so.
No. I'll try and think of one more. There's an author that I really, really love. Her name is Melinda Lowe. And her stuff is so good with atmosphere. She's really, really good with sort of creating a mood for the entire novel, and everything, like her descriptions and her settings and everything just really lends itself incredibly well to atmosphere. She's really fun. And then Marie Lu is very similar. I'm sure you guys know Marie Lu. She is just the sweetest, loveliest, kindest person, and then she writes the most amazing books, and you're like, Marie, you can't be good at everything, but she is.
I love her books. I'm so excited to read Wildcard.
Fantastic.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
See, that's the feeling, like, oh my god, they're friends. That is so cool.
There's my headless husband.
The Romanian. He speaks Romanian.
Yeah, well, he speaks Romanian. He's not from Romania.
Oh, no? Oh, I thought he was from Romania. I'm sorry.
No.
Okay, so last question. What are you reading?
Right now, I am reading a book by Caleb Roehrig. It's called Death Prefers Blondes. It is about a girl who leads a team of drag queen art thieves. and they dress up like drag queens and they steal things, and it's amazing and super fun.
Okay, wait, what's the title again?
It's called Death Prefers Blondes.
Oh my god, I'm so going to look for that.
Yes, yes.
That is so cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm picking it up. Almost done. Sorry, husband. Sorry. The kids are waiting as well. Anyway, we're wrapping it up. So there are not any more questions, but people know that they can always ask you on Twitter.
Yes.
And part of my stalking was for a few months now. I've been tweeting and freaking out about the Slayer, and you've been like the tweets. I was like, oh my god, she's noticing. Oh my god, I'm going to do the live stream. She's gonna think I'm a stalker. Why did I tweet that?
That's why I put it out there. It's social media. We're there to be social. It's okay.
But it's really, I'm really glad that you seem really lovely and you seem really accessible and open to talk about your process and your writing, and that's really great. I think it's really important, especially nowadays, for readers, especially YA readers and YA people and teenagers, to talk to authors and know who they're reading and who they're consuming, and know that we share values. So thank you so much for writing your books and making an effort to include all kinds of people, complex people, POCs, LGBTQs, and all of that. Thank you very much, and thank you for taking the time to do this.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This has been so fun.
I'm glad you enjoyed. So relieved.
Yes. Thank you. Bye, guys.
Muito obrigada, gente, todo mundo que assistiu. Obrigada por assistirem até agora. Eu vejo vocês no próximo vídeo. Tchau, tchau.